So it's my great pleasure to introduce Rick McElroy from Carbon Black. Rick is the head of security strategy. Rick has 20 years of information security experience educating and advising organizations on reducing their risk posture and tackling tough security challenges. He's held a number of security positions, including the US Department of Defense and across industry in retail, insurance, entertainment, cloud computing, and higher education. Rick's experience ranges from performing penetration testing to building and leading security programs. As a US Marine, Rick worked including physical security and counterterrorism services. His current role takes him all over the world, working with organizations on how to develop their security strategies and howling on about security and privacy. Over to you, Rick.
Cheers, thanks for that. I appreciate you. All right, thanks everybody. First thing I'll say is thank you for taking the time out. I know exactly how busy all of us are. And so I'm always humbled when people show up to hear me talk. So thanks everybody for being in the room. And hopefully I'll provide a bunch of stuff today that will be educational, informative, hopefully a little entertaining, and get you to rethink your security strategies. That's what I'm really hoping to drive as an outcome, right? So we're going to talk about the modern threatscape. We're going to go into the defender's advantage, right? Frankly speaking, I'm tired of hearing that the adversary has all the advantages, because that is not true, and we're going to talk about two specific ones today. And then we're going to talk about how we use those to tip the scales back in our favor. Does that sound good to everybody? Awesome. So I used to present this slide, and it was very distinct vertical categories. It started on the left with hacktivism, and then on the right with nation-state actors. Well, guess what? It's all kind of blending, right? I mean, you have WannaCry that's using our nation-state tools that were leaked, Eternal Blue, Eternal Red's running around on Linux boxes right now. You have a bunch of new countries in the mix, right? It's like a bunch of toddlers with shotguns that are just spraying out new code. We're getting really close to human lives being affected. 911 and emergency systems are being shut down. You know, there was an incident in Saudi Arabia recently, and if you read about it, there was 3 bad lines of code in this attack. Had the attackers gotten those 3 right, the whole place would have exploded. Now, I don't say that to scare anybody. I don't say that to drive uncertainty or doubt. Those are just the realities of where we're at, right? So we see it as cyber warfare, whether that's espionage and intelligence gathering, whether somebody doesn't like your country and wants to do some sort of activity to protest against it. All of this stuff, right, we as defenders have to deal with. When I was building my programs, you know, a lot of my programs, I never worried about nation-state actors. Frankly speaking, they didn't fit my threat profile. But now I have to worry about techniques, tactics, and procedures that adversaries and nation-states are building and spending millions of dollars on, winding up in commodity malware. That's a problem. The other issues we have is that, my slides decided to just go. Right, so we have this constantly evolving environment, right? I'm sure we've all felt this in our programs. Lawyers are involved in telling us what technologies to deploy. Cyber insurers across the globe are telling people what to put in. So now a bunch of people that don't actually know security tell us how to do our jobs, right? We have new policies, we have new regs, all the time. I mean, each state in America is putting one out. So we have to deal with all of that in the states. You guys have new privacy laws. You guys have new security things like ASD Essential 8. We spent a lot of time at FST Gov talking about that yesterday, right? So these mandates are starting to come out to help better protect systems, but they're not giving us the bodies to actually come in and implement those things and do them well. The other problem we have is time is definitely not on our side. Does anybody have all the assets they need to do security in the room? They never gave me enough money, they never gave me enough people, and certainly it's time, right? I mean, look, we're just humans. I like my family, I like being home. I don't like coming in at 3 a.m. to troubleshoot some unknown bad actor that's occurring, but guess what? We met with all of our incident response partners 2 days ago, and every single one of them said the same thing when they presented back to us. And then this happened on Christmas. And then it was Friday at 5 p.m. Why? Because the attackers know we're all going home. And then that's when they're going to do their nefarious stuff. But guess what? We don't get Christmases. We don't get long holidays. And all of that stress, all of that, we have to be right all of the time, right? It's causing a bunch of us to quit the industry. There's a recent survey that said 38% of all information security professionals are just walking away. That's a crazy number because we have anywhere from 700,000 to 2.5 million jobs, depending on the report that you read, open in the world. So how do we close that gap with 38% of us walking out the door? We got to do a little better as a community, right? We got to help each other. We need effective strategies that give us our time back. The other issue we're dealing with, and this is a fairly small vendor floor, but I do all of these events. If you go to RSA, there's thousands of vendors in this space. So as a professional, how do you pick one of these pieces of technology? How do you vet it? How do you test it? How do you know it's actually driving the outcome it's supposed to drive for you, right? Well, guess what? That lands back on us too. We have to have the ability to test these things. We have to have the ability to implement them. We certainly have to convince people to go procure them because these things aren't cheap, right? So we've spent a whole lot of time as an industry buying a bunch of stuff. And I'll make the argument it hasn't really mattered, right? Last year, most number of records leaked, most number of records hacked. The year before, same. So is all of this actually making a difference? I don't know. But let's talk about the things we can control, right? Our biggest advantage as defenders is it's our home field. The bad guys have to recon us all the time. When they land in your systems, they don't know where they are. They just know they popped a Windows box. So they start reconning. They're gathering asset information. What's on this box? What processes are running? How can I laterally move? Is that a database? What's in that database? Can I sell that on the dark web? Can I monetize it? And oh, by the way, at the end of their chains, what they're doing, regardless of their goal and effort when they get in, is they're dropping ransomware, they're cryptojacking, and there's a huge rise across the world in destructive attacks. So when you back an attacker in the corner, what are they going to do? They start burning your infrastructure. There's a recent attack in America where the attackers went after the backups first. That was the first thing they did. They deleted all the backups and then ransomed all the systems. That sucks. Like, frankly speaking, if I was running that program, I don't know how I'd hang my head for a long time. I mean, that's a crappy place to be in. So what we have to do is get our assets in order. We have to know what's on our home field, right? We have to turn our lights on. There's this idea in law enforcement, right, called collective defense. It works pretty much like this. You look at the statistical information, and you say there's a lot of muggings in my neighborhood, right? Like people are getting mugged. So the neighborhood gets together, they work with law enforcement, and they all trim their hedges together, right? They put in more street lights to provide visibility. Collectively as a group, we can start to do that as defenders as well. We need to start trimming our hedges together. We need to get our assets in order. We need to understand our baselines so that we can understand what abnormal is when it occurs, right? I can tell you when you're off threat hunting, doing incident response processes, or any of these things at the tail end of the breaches, you're waiting around a lot to figure out what happens. And in a lot of cases, we're wasting a lot of time chasing down good known applications that do things like the bad actors do, right? I mean, if you've ever had to go into an environment with WMI and SCCM and sort out whether that's a bad actor or Microsoft doing what it's supposed to do, you're going to waste a lot of time, and inevitably you come up with false positives, right? You don't even find the bad actor. We got to cut all that time down. Where I live, and I did some research before I came over, you guys have a very similar climate to Southern California, right? We have wildfires that are going crazy. I think my county's probably already preparing for the next wave because it's been real rainy this year. But what are we able to do? We're able to use data analytics. We're able to look at fire conditions. They're starting to put in sensors. We move and pre-position air assets and firefighters. So San Diego firefighters will go up to San Francisco and fight fires, right? Same thing for LA County, same thing for San Diego County. We pre-position those air assets knowing that at some point that fire is going to break out, right? I think as defenders, we need to do a little more of that. We need to figure out that at some point a breach will happen. I don't care how much of this stuff you stop. If it's a determined enough adversary, they're going to get in. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the adversaries work in a minute. And hopefully that gives you a better understanding of why at some point the defenses are going to break down. We're humans, right? There's a lot of us involved. Someone's going to click on a thing. You're not going to have time to tune a system. Oh, I missed an alert because it was stuck in the middle of thousands of them. In the case of Target, right, that's what happened to them. Target was actually alerted on that breach. But when they went and reviewed their logs, it was like the 3,000th alert in that log. So we have all of these systems telling us things that are just false positives, and then we get alert fatigue and miss the one that's supposed to happen. We got to flip that a little bit. So what I like to talk about is preventing what you can. There are things that you can prevent, right? We've done a pretty good job with DDoSes, even though they're starting to have a comeback, right? I mean, that was a major thing in the early 90s. Now, you hear about them once a year, right? We need to think more like the Spartans. So I'm a huge fan of the movie 300 and the graphic novel. I'm a big geek. But one of the things I think about with the Spartans, right, is they chose where they were going to fight, right? They knew their terrain. Also, if you look at how they armed themselves, they didn't walk around in plate mail, right? They had giant shields and helmets to protect the most important things, right? If you get hit with a sword in the chest, you're probably going to fall on the battlefield, right? Oh, and by the way, they came up with a thing called the Phalanx, right? Looks like a giant turtle shell when they fought. Their spears were designed to reach out over that shield wall, right? So they started linking defense and offense together. They understand the techniques, and the procedures that their adversaries would use against them. They forced them into a bottleneck, and they defended what they need to. And the story of the 300 still resonates throughout history. We're still talking about Leonidas and those guys. So pick your areas to defend. You're probably not going to get enough money to defend all of them, so you're going to have to make some trade-offs. In some cases, you're going to have high-value assets, and you're going to decide, we need to figure out how to make shields for those high-value assets. In other areas, maybe you just rely on good detection and response, right? Shops all over the world, from the largest shops to the smallest shops, are choosing, right, a better detection model, a better way to respond that's faster to root cause, to actually see the adversaries when they're doing what they're doing and move to disrupt that activity in real time. These are humans on humans battling. Detect and respond where you can't, right? I fly all over the world. When I give this talk in the UK, it's very easy. They have more CCTV cameras than anywhere, right? But what I'm keenly interested, especially in that market, and I was very blessed to travel with the former head of counterterrorism for the UK, and he said, hey, when we have an attack, it's very visible, right? Same thing in cyber. The Westminster attack, right? People are like, oh, that was bad. You had someone with a car start running people over. But do you know what the law enforcement response time was on that? Sub 60 seconds. That's pretty outstanding. They've chosen to take a stance that you can't prevent all of these attacks. You can deter some things. You can build concrete structures at the sidewalks and around your key locations. But what they're really good at is seeing what happens and responding rapidly. And I think that's a better model. If they chose to spend all of their money on prevention, it's probably not going to work out in the end, right? So here's why, right? When the attackers get inside your environment, they are going to look exactly like you. The first thing they're going to do when they land on a box is start popping your credentials. So whether that's, using Mimikatz to reach into memory and grab those, system admin creds and start moving around, that's what they're going to do, right? So it's very hard to detect, is that normal sysadmin behavior or is it an adversary? We have to have the visibility to see that. We have to be able to determine what's the noise and what isn't, and they camouflage themselves very, very well. But we got to be able to tell, in the end, which one's the adversary and which one's just background noise. So let's talk about kill chains. Is everybody familiar with the term kill chain? Yes, that's awesome. So the first name kill chain was Lockheed Martin in 2011. Right? I think Lockheed did an excellent job publicizing how attacks work, right? I think one of the issues with it is they still treat it as a linear process, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why attackers don't work in a linear fashion. But it was pretty good, and we all built upon it, and it was great, right? Well, boom, I'm a bigger fan of MITRE ATT&CK. Is everybody familiar with MITRE ATT&CK that came out last year? So MITRE, for the first time ever, gave us the Bible of TTPs, right? The techniques, the tactics, and the procedures that the adversaries use against us. So things like credential harvesting, how do they do that? How do I do that on a Windows box? How do I do that on a Mac? They give you a list of these techniques, right? And oh, by the way, it's rare that a new technique shows up. It's about every 18 months that you'll see a new technique. So once you can start to look for these techniques, once you can start to describe them, you can start to build your technology to detect and prevent those. And I would argue that MITRE ATT&CK has moved the needle for defenders greatly. I mean, if anybody wants to go look at the MITRE ATT&CK testing reports, it's amazing how many vendors had to change their gear as a result of that, right? I can tell you, and I do work for the vendor, we didn't have to change anything. Our fundamental technology operates on the premise of recording all of the things and not determining what's bad or good, right? Because the bad guys know how our technology works. They know how all the defensive technology works. You know, if you go look at the Vault 7 and Vault 8 releases, those were from the Central Intelligence Agencies. You can look up two things, Marble and Grasshopper. You can start to see how they were doing implants on Mac boxes. You can start to see how they were evading things like semantics, Sophos, Trend, all of these traditional technologies. And oh, by the way, that was leaked as well. And then those techniques were seen in the wild shortly thereafter, right? So the bad guys actually buy defensive technologies, deploy it to figure out how to work around it. And they're very iterative in that process during the attack chain. We talk about cognitions of an attacker, right? So how do they think? How do they work? We know a lot of this because our background from the company is offensive hackers that came out of the US government that were trained to do this professionally. We understand how they work. And they generally work like this. They're going to do some sort of recon. Once they do the recon, they're going to infiltrate into your systems. Once they infiltrate, they're going to start to do all kinds of things. But most people think of this as a linear progression. Like I have to do recon to get to manipulation, and then I got to do manipulation to get to exfil. It's not actually true. Is everybody familiar with OODA loops? Observe, orient, detect, and act. So it actually came out of World War II, right? When we started dogfighting, the pilots that could make decisions faster in that particular loop were better able to take down their adversary, right? It's been adopted for cybersecurity, but the OODA loops work more like this. Inside of each one of those phases, they're going to change what they do depending on what the previous phase was. If you treat these things as a point-in-time decision, like a lot of the technologies do, you're going to miss it. You got to chain all of those events together to see them over time, because they can skip steps. They can go back to step 1. They can iterate through 3. So we look at it more of a life cycle of the attack. We think of it more as a prevention loop, not a one-time prevention, a detection loop, a response loops. There's inputs, there's outputs, and things you should change as a result of what the attackers are doing. If you can start to build your detection strategies and prevention strategies that way, you can get a whole lot more agile in battling and performing OODA loops against the adversary. So when we used to do things, it was very rare that someone would stop us from doing things, but when they did, typically what occurred is this. And I'll overlay it over the MITRE kill chain for now to simplify it. So it starts at the front, we get initial access, we then move to execution persistence, all the things, right? Generally speaking, what happens, and almost all the technologies in this space work at the end of the chain, when the data is being exfilled, when the execution is occurring. We believe that if you drive that visibility up that kill chain, what you can actually do is start to make the attackers work harder. Their job is way too easy. They are not writing new code. NSA says they haven't seen a 0 day in 28 months. You know why? Everybody familiar with Emotet? It's the #1 piece of malware in the world. It actually came out in 2012 as a banking Trojan. Now it's pretty cool. It's like the Swiss Army knife of APT actors. So Emotet is still running around the world and we haven't stopped it. It's a little crazy to me, right? Once you can start to drive this up the chain, what you can actually start to do is stack detectors and prevention together, right, to provide that better chance of stopping the attackers. Because look, during the recon phase and initial access, sure, it's a compromise, but it's not horrible. You're not going to have to go on the headlines or disclose a breach. But once it gets to the end of that chain, that's where it's really bad, right? That's where CISOs are getting shot in the leg they didn't know about. I'm glad everybody saw the keynote this morning. So look, when we talk about disruption in depth with Windows, Does anybody know how many techniques are associated with lateral movement on a Windows box? It's 37. It's only 37 things. It's not infinity things, right? On a Windows box, there's only so many things you can do to credential harvest. PW dump, Mimikatz are the most prevalent. So once you can start to overlay, and again, if you want to go check out MITRE ATT&CK, it's pretty awesome. But once you can start to overlay that over the portions of the kill chain, what you can actually start to do is stack this stuff together. So in this particular instance, what does ransomware actually look like from a techniques, tactics, and procedures perspective? Looks a bit like this. You're going to get a spear phishing attachment. There'll be a link to the spear phishing. Hey, someone's going to touch volume shadow copy on that endpoint. That happens with every piece of ransomware that's out there. Oh, and oh, by the way, ransomware is going to start to grab credentials so it can lateral move. It'll do something like pass the hash or pass the ticket, meaning I grab your hash password out of memory, and then now I'm passing that around the network to other boxes. If you have system administrators that have local admins on your boxes, I would just tell you, you got to do that right now. If you had one effort when you go back, either MFA or start getting rid of your admin accounts locally to systems, and you'll be in much better shape. So they often say this: we have to be right 100% of the time, right? The attackers only have to be right once. I hate that because it's actually not true. We get multiple at-bats. There are a chain of events that occur over a breach. In this particular case, and this comes from our good partner, Red Canary. So if anybody's interested in learning more about this stuff, their blog is amazing, right? I love the Canary guys. But look, Outlook opened Word, no big deal. How many times does that happen in a day? Probably across the globe, millions of times. I mean, users are always opening Word docs, right? But then Word spawns a command shell. Well, that's weird. Why would Word ever spawn a command shell? And then that command shell calls psexec, PowerShell. Is everybody familiar with PowerShell? It's by the way, on every Windows box. And then Windows just added a new shell, and they're bringing PowerShell to Linux. Like, that's a thing now. So now we have all these shells for attackers to interact with. PowerShell happens to be the most prevalent. But if you wanted to take a look into your organizations from a system privilege misuse perspective, go look at PowerShell, go look at WMI. So the number one thing that attackers are doing. But look, when we can stack this stuff together, we actually get 4 shots of stopping this, not 1. So it's 1 attack, we get 4 shots, they get 1 shot. And I hate that we're not having a bigger impact on them, right? So I know I've covered a whole lot. I know I've talked about a lot of things. MITRE ATT&CK, TTPs, all of these things. Look, we have to simplify. We have to go back to what works. What works is visibility, response, and oh, by the way, that visibility is also going to make better prevention decisions upstream. As an example, a user clicked on a link. Was it because Adobe wasn't patched? Right? Did my content filter let me down on that? Did my spam filter let me down? You can actually get into iterative tuning loops on all of the other technology that you have. Every attack should make us better collectively as a group. We should learn from all of those attacks, and we should make changes as a result. We're not fast enough in making those production changes, and this speed is how we're eventually going to catch up to the attackers. Because look, in the end, when they're inside your environment, you only have to be 1 step faster, right? And they do make mistakes all the time. They make mistakes in codes. They're noisy sometimes. Not everybody is a ninja. Not everybody is a nation state actor, right? There's a whole lot of script kiddies still out there that are just grabbing things from GitHub, kludging them together. So remember, you only have to be 1 step faster, right? But it's really about this. They only have to be successful once. That's a horrible premise, like, as an industry, right? Like, think about the pressure and stress that comes with security leaders and people that care about their security programs, where it's like, we miss one thing. Like, we did a great job for 20 years and missed one thing, and we got walked out the door and fired, right? And have a hard time getting the next job. I say we need to flip this. When they are inside my environment, when they're on my field, I'm going to demand that they have to be 100% right. And I can guarantee you the number of people in the world that could be 100% right is very small, very, very small. You know, the groups that are out there publishing these new techniques, I mean, they're spending millions of dollars and they have entire wings behind them, right? when they're inside your house, turn the lights on, right? If an attacker comes into your home, what's the first thing you do at night? You're probably going to turn your lights on and get some visibility. Then you're probably going to move to respond, right? Maybe that's you get out of bed. Maybe that's you pick up the phone and call emergency services and the police, right? It's the same thing we should be doing with our systems. When they're inside, we should know about it, and we should move to disrupt them as fast as possible. And here's what happens from a macro level. Think about that kill chain. If I make an attacker take manual steps along every single one of those and have to iterate his code to get to the next step, guess what happens? Generally speaking, unless, again, they're a very persistent threat, they're going to move on to an easier target. They just are. The attackers are concerned about their time and their ROI as well. So I like frustrating attackers, right? I like to be able to disrupt them, do things like deception, slide them under the other environments, dictate the battlefield, right? That's one thing we're really not good at, is dictate the battlefield, but they are. From a macro sense, it's a $1 trillion economy. We spend about $100 billion in security professionals. It's like 10x, right? The only way we're going to make a dent in this is to make their jobs harder, is to waste their time, is to frustrate the attackers. It's too easy. Think about this. There are people paying rent to ransoming systems. Like, they're paying their rent doing that. They're not always a cartel. They're not always a nation state. You can go on YouTube right now and look it up. 2 people in Romania with 2 servers. That's what they're doing. There's entire communities around the globe that are fostering this type of activity because no one's going to stop them, and the ROI is too easy, right? We have the ability to change this as a community. We can start to disrupt the economy behind cybercrime and attacks. And if we can start to do that, I think we have an actual chance of flipping the scales back to the defenders. So with that, I'll take questions, and thank you very much for listening. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, in that particular attack. Yeah.
So that was used deception, dictate the battlefield, frustrate the attacker?
Oh, no. In this particular case, what they did is provide visibility into the actual kill chain, right? So when Outlook spawned Word, you have to be able to record that data and look at it. Word then kicks off command execution. What is that command execution doing? The visibility of that kill chain. Correct. And it's going to vary per attack, right? Like it depends on the techniques attack. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. That makes sense? Awesome. Questions? Oh man, I answered everybody's questions. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So what's Microsoft doing about this, right? I think it's a fair question. They own a whole lot of the attack surface. I have to say, I used to bash Microsoft horribly over the head in my talks. I can't quite do that anymore. They've sort of made a lot of progress. So if you look at Windows 10 as a platform compared to Windows 7 and Windows 8, the level of effort to actually own a thing on Windows 10 is much harder. So they're thinning out the attack surface. Other things that they're doing, they're providing better visibility into things like process hollowing on the endpoint, which is a prevalent technique that the attackers do. They bought Hexadite, which gives them the ability to orchestrate some of this stuff. On O365, they have a SIM, right? They've got data analytics. They've got threat intel. So I would tell you, out of all of the folks in the world, Microsoft probably represents the biggest ability to thin that out, right? I mean, I think Mac and Apple have done a pretty good job with it. iPads are pretty hard to pop. iPhones are pretty hard to pop, but a Windows box is pretty easy. So I say give Microsoft another 2 years, and they might put us out of business. Who knows? Maybe not, because it's Microsoft, right? But I like the progress. Yeah, and they've hired an amazing amount of good people on the problem, and they get a lot of data, right? I mean, they get to aggregate that all in the cloud, and the better data, the more you can understand the behaviors, and then drive change on the endpoint. So yeah, certainly. They're not the old Microsoft they used to be. Yes, sir.
So, one of your suggested methods was to turn the lights on inside your environment.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do when your environment's evaporating? The concept of having an environment is disappearing.
Gotcha. So the question is, what do you do as compute becomes prevalent, right? And your environment's disappearing because there's no longer data centers. We're all in the cloud.
Ability to move to the cloud.
Yeah. So you have to provide protection where the data lives in transit and where people interact with it, right? So that's why we focus on the endpoint, not on network stuff, because that's where the data is, and that's where the bad guys are going to go. So as we continue to have mobile devices, as we continue to have laptops, yeah, people want to work wherever they do, and we all have cloud services. But you got to put that, as defenders, we have to put that whole picture together, right? So it's not to say you're not going to need a technology stack. It's just got to be an effective one for your particular use case, right? So as you're designing your solution, you have to really think about that mobility as an issue and having the visibility and prevention down there to stop that stuff that's occurring. It's why the endpoint has become prevalent over the last 5 years from an attack perspective. It used to be networks, right? Everybody want to get into the network. Now it's the endpoints because data centers are gone. Yeah.
The dilemma, though, is that we're seeing a move away from Windows PCs to iPads.
Yeah.
You know,
I think that's generally good for security
well,
right now.
But the vendors aren't moving. I mean,
I would tell you, I would argue we're moving as fast as we can, and some of it's not our fault.
yeah, no.
Like if you take an IoT as an example, right? When you have competitors that are competing on cheap, fast, and easy, security usually takes a back seat. So if anybody works for chip manufacturers, or we'd love to talk to you about partnering up and helping the problem. So some of it's like providing the footprint on like a mobile endpoint to actually do something like streaming prevention or streaming detection too, right? So lots of vendors in the space are talking to manufacturers for sure. So I know that's not a quick answer. I know that's not something you can take back to your program tomorrow, but it's going to take us a while as a community on that one for sure. Yeah, and even Chromebooks, right? I mean, Chromebooks represent a good way for executives and people who don't have to do a lot of things to be protected, right? You can look at application whitelisting products that are out there, right, and go with a positive security model. Only known good runs. I mean, that's generally what Apple's done, right? Unless you jailbreak that device, you can only get an approved app from the store, and they do a pretty good job vetting theirs. You know, Bouncer with Google's a little wonky sometimes. You know, they still let stuff slip through, but Apple's pretty good. So if you have executives, tell them to use an iPad. Why not? Chances of them getting pwned with an iPad is pretty low. And I know it concerns us, right, because we can't control them and that stuff. But if I had a concern about one of my executives being targeted, I'd move them over to an iPad. Other questions? All right, with that, again, I will thank everybody for their time. I know exactly how important and how little time you get, so thank you guys for coming to listen to me talk. We're Carbon Black. We'll be out in the hallway and hanging out all day, so if you have other questions, come find us. Thanks, everybody.